Hi there. I hope you're going to enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but before you do, you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners, either through our Buzzsprout website or through Patreon. I want to give a sincere thank you to Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, and Mikhail Langner. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of the Lutheran History Podcast. The year looking at 2025, a lot of our episodes will be focused on the 175th anniversary of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. A lot of the people I'll be talking to are returning guests. Some of them will be new. Today we welcome back a long-time no-see guest, Dr. Tim Grundmeier from Martin Luther College. We had a lot of good conversations earlier on in the podcast history. Been a good resource for me, helping and encouraging me both for the podcast and also in my academic studies. So I'm glad to have another opportunity with you today, Dr. Grundmeier.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and today we just this is a little unorthodox for us for a show format. We said, hey, let's just talk about Johannes Muehlhaeuser, the first and founding president of the Wisconsin Synod. People should probably know something about him if they're interested in WELS history. So first, let's talk about, well, who is he? What's his background?
Yeah, and again, thanks, Ben, for having me on. I'll first confess I am not a Johannes Muehlhaeuser expert by any stretch of the imagination. I've done some reading and research into his life. Although I will say that one thing is there just isn't there's a couple pretty good articles about Muehlhaeuser, but there's still not kind of a definitive treatment of his life. So to me, like, kind of trying to understand him, some of the details on his life are I don't want to say like sketchy, but we just don't really know fully everything. Yeah, exactly. Although we have some, when it comes to his European background, we have some pretty good knowledge there. So I'll just start so he's born in 1803 in southwestern Germany in Württemberg. He really begins his life as a baker. That's really where, he's in the trades, moves to Switzerland for a time, and it's there that he gets associated with the Young Men's Society at the Saint Chriscona Pilgrim Mission. And so, as I understand it, he's essentially kind of receiving like a kind of a missionary training, but what that means there is basically kind of being trained in almost what we today might call personal evangelism, right? Mm-hmm. It's basically like taking these tradesmen and equipping them to share the gospel with their neighbors. So
kind of like a tent ministry sort of thing.
Yeah. Although, so he's 2 years in Switzerland, and again, spending time with this St. Chriscona Pilgrim Mission. And then he kind of goes on for 3 years throughout different parts of Europe, working part-time as a baker, and then also like distributing Christian literature is often kind of the way that he would go about this kind of personal evangelism. So he spends time in Bavaria, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia. So he for 3 years and we actually have a decent amount of information because he writes a kind of autobiography of this time later in life. So we know some information about that. Then after he's done with that, then there's this kind of 3-year, somewhat mysterious time to me. He moves back to Württemberg for a time, to Westphalia in Western Germany. And eventually he enrolls in the Langenberg Mission Society's mission school. And so this to me is more of a like formal training to be an overseas missionary. And so he studies there for 2 years, and the best as I can describe it, it's almost like he's uh, it's somewhat anachronistic, but it's kind of similar to the training, it seems to me, that like a staff minister would get in the WELS today. So it's training in theology, in the Bible, kind of, and some other practical subjects, but it's not a full-fledged like seminary level pastoral education that he's getting there. And so he spends 2 years there, and then he's commissioned by the Longenberg Mission Society to go to New York. And so he departs in 1837. He's accompanied by a man named Maximilian Ertel, who is actually a university-trained pastoral candidate. So actually, like, the idea is that Ertel is going to be the kind of more the pastor in New York, and Muehlhaeuser is going to be more the, he wants to start like a school attached to a congregation, and the wording used, he's going to be the I wrote this down, the practical spiritual advisor at the congregation. So again, it seems to me, again, it's a little bit anachronistic, but it kind of similar to how like a WELS person today might view it, like a staff minister's role,
or maybe a deacon in other circles.
Yeah, that's it. Right.
Someone who's been trained, spiritually minded, but doesn't have the full education or a broader calling. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So that's how he comes to America. Then when he's in New York City, he's only in New York City for a few months. Basically, their kind of plan doesn't work as well as they were hoping. The school that Muehlhaeuser is hoping to found never really gets off the ground. His partner Ertel is interesting because he actually falls in with the Stephanites, who are the kind of predecessors to the Missouri Synod. So he'll actually, I'm trying to remember how it exactly goes for him. I think he eventually moves to Missouri for a brief time, but then becomes disenchanted, joins the Roman Catholic Church for a time, and eventually returns to Lutheranism. So Ertel and Muehlhaeuser's partnership is very short-lived. But then Muehlhaeuser's in the situation, I'm in America, what am I going to do? And he gets recommended by another Lutheran pastor in New York City to go to meet with the president of the New York Synod, or the New York Ministerium, Augustus. Trying to remember his name, Wackerhagen, I think is his name. Yeah, Wackerhagen. And so in March 1838, just a couple months after Muehlhaeuser's arrived in the United States, he has this interview with Wackerhagen. Wackerhagen's impressed. He says, "Oh, this guy is really spiritually minded. He has a great heart for people, great heart for the gospel. One of his problems is that he doesn't have any training in the biblical languages." But I'm going to say this guy can have a temporary license to be a pastor of the New York Synod. And I'm going to assign him to this congregation in Rochester. And then at the following meeting of the New York Ministerium, the official annual meeting, that's when Muehlhaeuser's ordained. And so he becomes an ordained pastor serving this mission congregation in Rochester. So that's how he finally comes into the pastoral ministry.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that is my studies, and I'm sure you've seen it too. That's pretty normal for these East Coast older synods. We don't have seminaries yet, or at least not too many. It's right. The much longer tradition is to have someone who shows some aptitude and maybe a bit of education, license him, see how he does, and then have a pretty, by some standards or some accounts, a pretty intense examination prior to that ordination. So kind of not totally dissimilar from having like a vicar year kind of on your own. And then proving yourself before you're ordained.
Right. That's right. And you're right, because the General Synod Seminary in Gettysburg is founded in 1826. I mean, there's the Hartwick Seminary that's founded shortly before then, but a lot of the pastors in like the United States before that, their seminary education is essentially studying for a couple years, like privately under the supervision of like a prominent pastor. Actually, that's the person who founds the Minnesota Synod, Father Heyer. I mean, that's kind of his educational background. He studies for a time under a pastor in Philadelphia, a couple pastors in Philadelphia, and then eventually is ordained, is licensed and then ordained. So yeah, you're right. That's like the system for licensing and ordination used by these American Lutheran church bodies in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, for sure. So yeah, so then he's going to serve in Rochester, Muehlhaeuser, for 10 years. And this is always interesting to me as a Wisconsin Synod historian. It seems as if those 10 years really get kind of glossed over in Muehlhaeuser's life, just in the articles written about him, and just in the kind of the histories of the Wisconsin Synod, including the famous one by J.P. Kaler, the kind of probably the standard history, if you will, or the old standard history for the Wisconsin Synod. It's just, oh, he was in Rochester for 10 years. I'm like, well, that's really important, right?
Yeah.
Although you've uncovered some letters that he wrote during his time there.
Yeah. And I think, as you were saying earlier, you're not like the dedicated Muehlhaeuser scholar expert, neither am I, but we both done the kind of peripheries of his life, and we both dipped our toes into study. And like you said, I kind of call those the silent Muehlhaeuser years, or the before Wisconsin, I think was the title of that article. And all I did was translate 7 or 8 letters he wrote into a rather under rated Lutheran paper before Der Lutheran Honor, the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, and so the earlier episodes are about that. But that, I think, shows his mission zeal, because he's in this poor little congregation in Rochester, and he's gathering pennies on the dollar from these poor, that's probably not the right expression, but he's gathering small amounts of money from his members to send to foreign missions, because the way I understand in his biography, he was originally wanting to go to a foreign, non-Germanic field, and then he got shifted over to the United States. And so I think he always had for a while this kind of heart for foreign missions, which is interesting, because I don't know if there's a line you can draw today, but that's been part of at least the WELS culture I'm very familiar with, is there's always a big place in people's hearts for foreign missions. And that's what he was about in Rochester, at least as far as his public interactions through the paper.
Yeah, no, I remember reading that article, and that struck me. Yeah, no, you're right about, these German mission societies. I think the our Wisconsin Synod centric view of them is like, oh, these are the places that sent pastors to America. Well, that was just a part of their mission. It was also to send these missionaries to Africa, right? To parts of, some in India, for example, right? So it's, I think you almost wonder if Muehlhaeuser, just because he never serves in a foreign mission context, if that was something he always, maybe he's living vicariously through. No, that's a great. Yeah. The other thing, though, that comes up with him in Rochester, and I don't know if you've encountered this, that there's perhaps the first recorded use of a Christmas tree in a worship space in the United States. Have you ever seen that before?
I mean, just today I was reviewing my materials on him, and I saw that, which is sad, because the Heinrich Schwann was the guy who got the credit for that, Wyneken's nephew, but that's he comes after that, so maybe Muehlhaeuser gets the Christmas tree credit.
This is always my thing, though, with these like famous firsts. It's like, well, it's the first recorded that we I'm sure there was maybe someone else that had put a Christmas tree in although it's a German tradition, and there's not a ton of pastors originally from Germany in the United States in the 1830s, 1840s. So maybe you can credit Muehlhaeuser with that.
It's kind of it's funny, like it's a who cares sort of thing, but more than one, it pops up. More than one person gets the credit for it. It's almost like it's a
Right.
competition who can put up a Christmas tree first. So yeah, it's
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. It's one of those things where I haven't looked deeply enough into like the apparently it's like recorded in the local Rochester newspaper that his church had this Christmas tree, and like Muehlhaeuser was talking about the significance of it and things like that. So yeah, again, it's one of those, like you said, it's kind of fun trivia, but maybe there's something more significant to it than that. But
yeah.
I mean,
I
it
know some
seems
of
as,
them.
oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say some of them took a lot of flack for that because it's almost like to a Calvinist, it's like idolatry, right? You're putting up an
Right,
image, or a Asherah pole or whatever they want to call it, right? You're
right, right.
profaning the worship space because of their yeah, more
Yeah,
literalistic
almost has like
view of the
a
commandments.
pagan
Yeah,
connotation. Yeah,
yeah. And I don't know if that originated back then. It definitely still pops up now, though, for
right,
sure.
right. The other thing I wonder, you know, during Muehlhaeuser's time in Rochester, and we don't have to spend forever on this, but I mean, Rochester, upstate New York, this is one of the centers of the Second Great Awakening, right? This is one of the centers of, and so it makes me wonder. I mean, because Muehlhaeuser is going to have these ties with different American evangelical organizations. I'm guessing. I mean, he's making some connections during this time to some degree with different aspects of or different people within American evangelicalism.
Yeah,
Because when he moves to Wisconsin eventually, and we can get to that. I mean, he's goes under the auspices of the American Tract Society, which is one of
yeah,
these evangelical organizations, part of what people call the benevolent empire, right? This kind of collection of these interdenominational organizations associated with antebellum evangelicalism. So I mean, I have to imagine that that context in Rochester played some impact on his views and on it, certainly on his
yeah.
personal connections.
Well, he kind of Americanized. He came to terms with I'm an immigrant in a new country. I'm a Lutheran in a new country. What does that mean? Well, his context was also the New York Synod, the New York
Right.
Ministerium. Well, they were all kind of more, we just get along with our surrounding culture, our fellow Christians. We don't make a big deal about those distinctions. So that's just, kind of an isolated guy. If he had other influences, we don't know what they would have been other than the immediate context that we just mentioned. So
Yeah.
he probably is just doing what was kind of normal to him, honestly.
Yeah. And again, it would be interesting if more sources could be uncovered about his time in New York. I mean, the one thing I found is his kind of brief mentions in the minutes of the New York ministerium.
Mhm.
And, so he attended the convention, or he gave a little report about his mission church at the convention. But I mean, it's very just scattered stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's in 1848 when he resigns his call there, and not it seems to me not because he's has a problem with his church in Rochester. He just has this deep calling to move to Wisconsin to reach out to this largely growing German immigrant community there. I mean, he has another guy he knows, Johann. Is it Johann Weinman?
I
Weinman?
was just wondering what his first name was. I
Yeah,
didn't know where you're
I
going.
should have double checked that before, but yeah. So I mean, this is someone he had gotten to know, also a missionary from Germany that had been asked to move out to Wisconsin by this congregation there, and apparently he gets a letter from him that kind of just like pulls at his heart, and so yeah, in 1848, 1848, he's off to Wisconsin.
Yeah, it is Johann. So you were correct.
Yeah, Johann
Yeah,
Weinman, who's I've looked into him a little bit too. Is interesting because he's going to be one of the other kind of founding
yeah,
pastors of the Wisconsin Synod. So,
yeah,
um, yeah, I mean the whole idea of him going to, I mean, it really is him sacrificing, a fairly stable situation in Rochester. Again, the like you pointed out, like initially this mission church is just this struggling thing, but it seems as if at least what he's recorded in the New York Synod minutes, like the congregation's kind of thriving at the time he leaves, and he's essentially going to Wisconsin not even as, without any congregation that's calling him. He's doing this traveling colporteur thing where he's
Yeah.
distributing literature and trying to kind of almost like back what he was doing in Europe all over again.
Right.
Which yeah.
Well, and I was thinking that too. I'm very hesitant. I'm not a big fan of the psychoanalysis of everyone, right, to the nth degree, where you have nothing to really build that on. But yeah, it does seem like he got maybe a case of Wanderlust, just
Right.
he probably thought back of his younger years. Oh yeah, I remember hiking through the Alps and spreading the gospel, and well, now I can do it again in Wisconsin, and it's the frontier, kind of explore a new area. Yeah, and still doing ministry, right, that he cares about,
Right.
kind of maybe thinking, oh, I still got a few good years left in me. I don't know. That's kind of how I kind of tell the story to myself, at least as I think about his life. Got a little
Yeah.
restless and said I
Yeah.
can move
And I
on.
mean, and if you want to keep going down that road, he's at the time he's 45. He's kind of in his middle age,
Yeah,
it's the, midlife crisis. I don't know. But you're right. I think all of
yeah,
these kind of initial pastors that, join like the Wisconsin Synod or the Minnesota, they have this kind of just this mentality of like just loving kind of the adventure of it. I mean, I think you
yeah,
almost have to some degree if you're going to you know give up so much and go out to again, like Wisconsin's the, I mean, 1848, this Wisconsin's just entering statehood, right? I mean, this is
yeah.
this is still the
Brand new.
frontier. Milwaukee's this kind of frontier city to some degree when Muehlhaeuser arrives
Totally.
there. But yeah,
Yeah, we don't normally think of Wisconsin as like the frontier or the West, but at that exact time in history,
yeah,
it certainly was.
yeah, right. Um, so it's interesting though when he gets to Milwaukee, he only lasts a few months in this Cole Porter kind of role. It's almost seems, I mean, again, just reading through like the few sources we have, it's just he wasn't really up for it to some degree again because it's a tiring kind of traveling life. But he ends up kind of being invited to kind of form this German speaking congregation in Milwaukee. And there's enough people here that join the church that it quickly becomes his full-time call. And of course, this is the church. I didn't realize this until I did my some of my research, that was initially called Trinity Lutheran Church, but after 2 years they changed the name to what it, well, I mean, it's still with us today, Grace Lutheran Church. And
Yeah,
this is
Grace
like his,
downtown.
yeah,
Yeah.
Grace downtown, as people in the WELS like to call it. And this is going to be the home base for Muehlhaeuser for, well, I mean, the rest of his life, is this
Hmm.
congregation. So yeah. And then of course it's from that position in Milwaukee that he's going to spearhead with a couple other ministers this new independent um, church body, the Wisconsin Synod, or the and interestingly, this is another thing I've just, the German Evangelical Lutheran Ministerium of Wisconsin was its original founding title, right? Kind of a play off of the New York Ministerium and Pennsylvania Ministerium,
Yeah.
although it's more often just called the Wisconsin Synod at the time.
Well, well, I think, yeah, and I wrote a little bulletin blurb that's going out for the anniversary. I think it was the first German,
Yes, that's right.
and that's the part where I say, okay, we maybe should contest that just a little bit, to be honest, because it's really the third
Yeah,
German
right.
Lutheran Synod in Wisconsin, Buffalo and Missouri, just years
Right.
apart, but yeah, which raises a question, right? And it's something I think the anniversary, at least the first chapter or the first round of history, may want to ask. Well, why the Wisconsin Synod? You already got two German Lutheran synods in town, um, or
Yeah,
even in the state.
right. And I mean, it's clear to me that Muehlhaeuser kind of used the church body he's founding as the more moderate alternative to the Missouri Synod and Buffalo Synod, who are both these old Lutheran church bodies. And so the Buffalo Synod and Missouri Synod are both considered old Lutherans in the United States, they really don't like each other very much. They have these disagreements on, especially the doctrine of the ministry.
Mm-hmm.
But they're both, yeah. I mean, what's the distinction here? I mean, one seems to me to be the confessional position. I mean, I'll just stick with the Missouri Synod since I know best. It stakes out very clearly, like in its initial constitution and just its whole ethos that, we unconditionally subscribe to all of the Lutheran confessions in the Book of Concord. And then also that it practices, what we would consider today, kind of church fellowship practices that I think that form the basis of the WELS church fellowship practices, very similar view. Now Muehlhaeuser's church body is kind of trying to be a more moderate alternative. So, the word that I often see in those years, and maybe you've seen this too in your own research, is, well, the Missouri Synod is too exclusive. Have you seen that? Like that?
Yeah, I think
word,
that popped up in so that my other tangent article is the Frank Kerler
right?
letters.
Those
And those
letters,
guys are writing, I came up with just from those letters, like easily 8, 10 adjectives used to describe what kind of Lutheran are we talking about here.
right?
And I think there's maybe Conrad Kester's writing back to the patriarch guy who's a pastor still in Germany, and he says, "Well, we're part of we're Wisconsin Lutherans. We're evangelical. We're not the exclusive type." Right?
Yes.
That's how he's defining WELS, and this is early 1850s, so right at this time period, right? Not so exclusive. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's always kind of, it makes sense to me in the context of the time, but then I try to explain that, and it always is like,
Yeah.
well, what does that actually mean? And I think in practice it means cooperation
Yeah.
with non-Lutherans. I think that in the end is probably the biggest thing, and maybe we can have disagreements on the non-fundamental doctrines in the Lutheran
Yeah.
confessions, I think maybe is another part of it. But it seems to be more in the Wisconsin Synod context, the church fellowship questions, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, Muehlhaeuser is very much he's participating. Well, maybe participating is the wrong word. He's cooperating with the other pastors in the Milwaukee area, non-Lutheran pastors in a whole variety of different things. I've discovered that he's accepting money from the American Home Missionary Society to fund his church starting there in
Yeah.
Milwaukee, which is
Wyneken did that
like,
too, by the way, but
what's that?
Wyneken did that too for a few
Yeah.
years
Oh,
early
yeah.
on.
No,
Yeah.
and this
So,
is, and actually
yeah.
a lot of the, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of like the Swedish pastors that found the Augustana Synod did that too. What I'd love to discover, Ben, or what I'd love to find is I know the American Home Missionary Society, Home Missionary Association papers are, I think they're at like Tulane University. I'd love to see if if there's some like reports that Muehlhaeuser wrote to them that, that would be just
Someone had done that
fantastic
and
discovery.
found the Wyneken letters, but it's like a microfilm of his horrible handwriting. So good luck.
Okay.
It's like one of those things where it's technically there, but is it worth it? But yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, that if you aren't going to do it, someone should check for
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Okay, can I go back to an earlier thing though? Like you're saying, well,
Yeah.
what makes Muehlhaeuser's Synod, as it's called by some people, different? And you're saying, well, and I agree that, they don't care about the fellowship stuff. They cross lines. They cooperate more. Those Frank Kerler letters, though, gave me maybe a slightly look at it, the same issue from a different perspective. Imagine, everything was in a neat, ordered little box. Like, so you got this puzzle put together, and then you just kind of throw that puzzle across the room. It lands on the floor. Well, that's what immigration does. And
Yes.
you're trying to, like, quick before they fall away. We lose a piece, or the Methodists grab them. Quick, put something together. And not to say that practicality is the driving issue, but I think it just simply means, in some ways, they were Lutherans who had different priorities. Like, let's
Right.
get congregations established and not instantly argue about who has to exactly do what, like in the old Lutheran congregations, where it was
Yep.
very, very much, especially the Buffalo Synod, very concerned about applications and principles and the kind of the nth degree of what this doctrine means in this new setting. They're trying to figure out the doctrine first in a totally new context. And Muehlhaeuser's almost the opposite. Like, let's just get the gospel preached. Let's
Yep.
be Lutheran, but let's figure all that later. And both had their problems. Both approaches had problems, I think, is what the record will tell us.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, I mean, the another adjective that comes to mind is, and there's probably a lot of truth to it, is that some people felt like that the old Lutherans were legalistic, perhaps you might say, in their application of say church fellowship practices or
Sure.
something like that. But
And
you're right.
Taylor will point that out in his history, and
Yep.
even like worship preferences. Like that's adiaphora, that's worship
Right.
preference, but you are becoming kind of odious to everyone else who doesn't agree to you in
Right.
that very specific application.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right, though. It seems like if you want to like understand, I mean, in my view, if you want to understand Muehlhaeuser's kind of central, I mean, he at his core is like, I want to start congregations. I want to gather people in, in this, and as you pointed out, like this immigrant setting, like where, there's people, and he'll use this in a couple of things I've found of his writings, like people are like sheep without a shepherd, right? And, um, and so if it kind of led to some kind of looser fellowship practices, that's kind of where it's where it's coming from, it seems to me. But
Right. And for us as well as Lutherans on the other side of the mid 20th century, the fellowship thing was kind of the litmus test. Are you a real Bible believing confessional Lutheran? Not as do you practice fellowship? So looking back to Muehlhaeuser, maybe that's the question, why is he controversial? Well, that's probably
yeah,
the main thing is confessionalism and fellowship, right?
right. And I mean that it is true. I mean, maybe we should just point this out. So Muehlhaeuser, 1850s, when the Wisconsin Synod's founded, he's going to serve as the president for 10 years. And then he'll retire from the presidency in 1860, but he'll still serve as this senior of the Wisconsin Synod, which, as I understand it, essentially he's the president emeritus, and he
Hmm.
kind of has a semi-official role still in the synod, in both the conventions as they're going on, even in the administration of things. So, I mean, and you point this out in your article. I mean, people will refer to in the 1850s, especially like the Wisconsin Synod as the Muehlhaeuser Synod, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he's that central of a figure. But I think a lot of Wisconsin Synod Lutherans today kind of look at Muehlhaeuser as like, well, he's kind of our flawed founding father to some degree. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't know like if that's I don't know if that's been your impression on how he's
Yeah.
talked about, almost kind of with a little sense of embarrassment. And I don't know if this podcast is supposed to be like rehabilitating his image or something, but
Let's put it all on the table and have a balanced real
yes,
historian conversation. That's kind of what we're here for, right? Let's have
yeah,
you don't have to come to a perfect synthesis where every kink is ironed out, right? But
right,
it's messy, and I think that, and this is something that why I find this period fascinating, is the conditions, the context are totally unlike anything that you and I have ever experienced.
yeah,
With the migration, immigration, all the huge shifts in theology and practice in Europe with the Prussian Union and so many other things. Um, the idea of like, oh, the church and state thing is gone, and that just all of that
right.
is total. What are you supposed to do, right? And there's no printed manual on exactly how to do everything.
No, that's exactly right. It's yeah, it is a time of it's a different context, right? You're exactly right. I agree. That's why I really enjoy studying like the 1840s, 1850s,
Mhm.
1860s, just because of the uh, complicated and contested nature of everything. Um, yeah, I mean, what to you seems to be the, I don't know, big questions about Muehlhaeuser's role in the first 17 years of Wisconsin Synod history, because again, he's such a central figure. And what seems to you to be the big questions that people listening need to think about?
Yeah, I
Maybe
need
we
to
can
think
try
about,
to answer them.
Well, I guess what made him a good enough leader to have a synod unofficially named after himself without him being, I had
Yeah.
seen no accounts of him being like a Grabau sort of hierarchical, tyrannical
Right.
figure, or a Stefan, where everyone's kind of got a personality cult built up around him,
Yeah.
or even a Walther, where he's such like an opinionated charmer kind of blended into one.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just, well, what is it? And there's an art, what in the very first edition of the WELS Historical Journal, article by, I think it's Arnold Layman.
Layman.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Edwin
Yeah.
Layman, different one. Well, he mentions how he's kind of a fatherly figure, but he's very pastoral, and I
Yes.
think that's kind of the key, kind of the kind of a trope now to say, but he was the right man at the right time in the right place to
Right.
get something good off the ground and established. And I think maybe what holds people back from giving a full-fledged seal of approval is, as I mentioned, okay, Wyneken had some of the same exact things: American Bibles or Tract Society support. Um, the Saxons in Missouri were, to use a phrase, a hot mess for a while with the whole,
Yes.
they had
Yeah.
problems, right? So everyone has problems. I think it's just maybe that did he not quite fully get on the confessional bandwagon, or did he just kind of step back and let others drive that? Because I
Yeah.
think he was probably one of the ones still pumping the brakes when Philip Kaler came in and said, let's, or Ryan came in and said, let's fix this.
Yeah. That's an interesting. So I think this is my question and I'll add something else about what makes studying Muehlhaeuser so difficult. I mean, you know, not only, the lack of, well, we touched on this already, the lack of sources. So you're aware that in the Wisconsin Synod archives, there's this whole wonderful collection of letters, the presidential letters collection, that was from Muehlhaeuser's presidency, from Johannes Bodding's presidency, that follows from these first 2 or 3 decades of Wisconsin Synod's history. And some of them have been translated, but most of the letters are letters written to Muehlhaeuser rather than by him, right? And so, like, getting even his own take on things, his own voice is difficult. And when it comes to like the theological position of not just Muehlhaeuser but the Wisconsin in general, it's not till 1865 that there's a church paper being published by the Wisconsin Synod, the Gemeindeblatt, right? So even getting like official statements, from these from Muehlhaeuser and other early leaders it's just difficult to come by. But my sense is Muehlhaeuser's lack of confessionalism has been, maybe put it this way, I think people have made more out of a few scattered statements of Muehlhaeuser about, I offer the hand of fellowship to every, I'm trying to remember the quote, a couple letters that are maybe not quite indicative of his true views. Put it this way, I mean, so in 1856, for example, this is the Wisconsin Synod's first convention after the publication of the Definite Platform, which is a proposal made by some Lutherans like Samuel Schmucker, Benjamin Quartz, basically to make alterations to the Augsburg Confession because, on issues regarding the sacraments. And the Wisconsin Synod's stand against this, led by Muehlhaeuser, is very strong, right? That the language I think in the minutes is this would be a suicide to the Lutheran faith, right? And so it seems to me that there's more,
Nuance.
maybe more confessionalism to
Yeah,
Muehlhaeuser than maybe I was led to believe initially when I first learned about
sure.
him. But I would agree that with you. Yeah, it seems to me and and this is always an interesting thing to me, the kind of younger generation of people like Johannes Bading, Philip Kaler, you mentioned, Gottlieb Brime, that it's kind of the younger generation that's the more, for lack of a better term, ardently confessional, staunchly confessional. And Muehlhaeuser still has this kind of, again, to use a phrase that's used at the time, like moderate Lutheranism that he's trying to hold on to. So whether is he actively pumping the brakes, or is he just always, although I don't think it's a coincidence that in it's the
68. Yeah.
68, it's 1868, the year after he dies, when the Wisconsin Synod officially starts making moves in these more, the direction toward the Missouri Synod, the direction away from the German mission societies, the direction away from the Pennsylvania Synod and the General Council. So I think there's probably something to the brake pumping metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe just, this is just kind of my working theory, is that, there wasn't maybe a fundamental disagreement. I don't think you would say, I don't agree about the Lord's Supper being real presence or whatever. No, about the confessions. It's that he's not like that. He's not like a schmucker to that degree at all. But it's more, I think it goes down to the priorities. It's like, okay, and maybe this is one of those other harsher quotes used against him, right? That confessions are paper fences, right? That's attributed to him. And okay, that's kind of hard to, you can pile a lot of context onto that, but it's still really hard to explain away that. But just the priority of let's get the church off the ground, but when do you ever say, okay, we're fully, firmly established enough to the point where we can actually care about these things? And I think that's, like you said, that younger generation, that's their priority. Let's set up the right fences, the right parameters for how we're going to operate as a synod, and then actually do the work.
Yeah. And I mean, I think another thing that could be a factor in the mix is Muehlhaeuser does have these relationships with a variety of different Lutheran leaders in the United States. I've been working on stuff on Muehlhaeuser and other early Wisconsin pastors' connection to the Pennsylvania ministerium, but Muehlhaeuser's a pretty close friend, it seems to me, of William Passavant, who's a leader from the Eastern Lutherans. He's not a member of the Pennsylvania ministerium. He's a member of the Pittsburgh Synod, but he's one of these confessional Lutherans in the East. But Passavant's very active in mission work. For example, he's someone that really gets the Minnesota Synod off the ground with his kind of like advocacy for it. He's also big on starting hospitals in the United States. So the Milwaukee hospital that he helped start, is Muehlhaeuser is kind of partnering with him in starting this Passavant hospital in Milwaukee. So I think there's whereas some of these younger pastors, they don't really have quite the same connections to these Eastern Lutherans. And I think that's maybe a factor also in the, Muehlhaeuser less wanting to move away from them. Whereas, someone like Johannes Bading, he's been around for a while, but he really never had these kind of connections to these non-Midwestern Lutherans, if you will. I think that's maybe another factor in the mix.
Yeah. And that's something that people can look forward to reading in the near future, right? That's a whole other project you've been working on.
We can discuss that another time.
Right.
Yeah, it ties into Muehlhaeuser because one of the things I've been researching, I'm hoping to have an article published this coming year on this subject, as Muehlhaeuser's kind of reaching out to the Pennsylvania Synod, which is at the time the largest Lutheran church body in the United States. It's the oldest Lutheran church body in the United States. It's called people refer to it as the Mother Synod of American Lutheranism. And basically, like Muehlhaeuser is getting convinces the Pennsylvania Synod to essentially, fund many of not completely, but offer kind of supplemental funding to many struggling Wisconsin Synod pastors. And so that connection between the two church bodies is really strong. And in some ways it's kind of spearheaded by Muehlhaeuser. So he's a guy that he's he's a, I don't know, a gatherer, you might say, or he's someone that is always interested in making these connections with, people, whether they be Lutherans or even non-Lutherans in some cases. So anyway, yeah, but we can maybe talk about that another time. So a little bit.
Yeah, I look forward to that. But it is all connected, but it's, like you said, part of the analysis of who he is and what makes him tick, a little bit bigger picture, or at least cares about relations with other Christians, maybe.
Yeah.
A bit to a greater degree than some of the others.
Yeah.
At least it expresses it differently. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think we've talked for about an hour on Johannes Muehlhaeuser.
Oh
We
yeah.
could probably go
Yeah.
longer, but I don't know. I think at least I made a pact to myself. I don't know if you agreed, but we would say one nice thing about him before we left in honor of the anniversary of the synod, which he was a founder of. Do you have one? I got one I can say. One
Well,
nice thing about Muehlhaeuser.
I've, yeah, I can say certain nice things.
Yeah.
While I agree, well, I'll give the caveat where I disagree with him on his, something like the confessions as paper fences comment and things of that nature. I will say that I just admire his mission zeal, which I think is, there from the outset in Europe. It's there when he's in the United States, this desire to reach out to these scattered German immigrants in Wisconsin, or before that in New York, right? And yeah, share the gospel with them and bring them into a congregation. I mean, that's like at the core of what we should be all about. So I admire that zeal, and I'm thankful for his legacy that way.
Well, good.
Yours?
I can't top that compliment. So I kind of anticipated that. So I went in a different direction of my
Okay.
nice thing. He is the first official WELS historian. He was,
That's right.
and then he did a pretty. He cared about something really important, WELS history, and it was kind of autobiographical. But he wrote the first synod history at the 10-year anniversary. So we have a tradition that goes way back in our synod of observing and actually doing something for an anniversary, because history is important. It's a story of God's work among his people, and that deserves to be recorded and preserved and proclaimed.
Well said.
He was a good start to that. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Grundmeier, for joining us today and talking about
thank you Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's fun. It's been a while, so it's been fun to come on the podcast again.
Yeah, well, we'll do it again soon.
Looking forward to it.